If you clicked on this video, you're an Adobe Premiere user and you're thinking about switching to DaVinci Resolve. I want to help you get started with that process, so let's dive right in. The first thing that you're going to see when you install DaVinci Resolve on your computer is this window. This is basically how you start a project for the very first time. Now, before we go any further, I want to make one thing really clear, and you don't save DaVinci Resolve projects in a folder like you do with Premiere. Instead, it lives in your C drive under the overall whole DaVinci Resolve application. You can take a project, right-click on it, and export projects or import projects, but we're not going to do that just yet. Just know that you can't save a DaVinci Resolve project just like you would an Adobe Premiere project. So what we're going to do is we're going to open up a new project to get started. We're going to go down to the new project window and hit that, and we'll call this tutorial getting started. Cool. We will hit create, and it's going to load up DaVinci Resolve. Now, if you're an Adobe Premiere user, this will look a little different, and I want to get you started with the overall UI. First things first, you'll see on the very, very bottom, there's all these tabs. Unlike Premiere, where you work in a single system and you can access everything pretty much at your fingertips, DaVinci streamlines the process to an extent. So you'll have a media tab, which will allow you to access media on your hard drive, a cut tab, which will help you sort your media, an edit tab where you'll edit. Fusion is motion graphics. Color is your color grading tools. Fairlight is all of your audio tools, and Deliver is where you render your video. Now, as an Adobe Premiere user, like myself, I never ever use the Media tab or the Cut tab. I live pretty much 90% of the time in the Edit tab, just like in Premiere, where I'm trying to do editing. So, with that in mind, let's take a look at the window that we have in front of us and diagnose what's going on. So the first thing we have is going to be our viewport right here. This is where we're going to see our footage that we'll import in very shortly. We have our media pool right here in the upper left. We have our timeline in the very bottom section of our screen. And we have our video properties. That's known as the inspector in the top right-hand corner. Before we do any project importing, I want to show you what I do to get started with my first project in DaVinci. And the first thing you want to do is go down to the little cog wheel in the lower right-hand corner. And this is going to give you your project settings. Now, the default is 1920 by 1080 HD. You have your frame rate. You have your playback frame rate. You have a couple other tools. Most of the time, you're not going to touch this. I always work in 4K, so I make sure I set this to 4K 3840 by 2160. And once I set my timeline resolution to 4K, the next thing I'll do is I'll go down to my proxy media setup. So just like in Premiere, you can make proxies or smaller versions of your video files, and it makes it easier to edit with. Now, DaVinci, you can set it to choose automatically, but just because I am impatient, I will always set my proxy resolution to quarter. It will look crunchy and gross when I'm video editing, but I know that when I render, it'll always look great. So I will always just set the proxy media resolution to quarter, and I'll set the proxy media format to H.264. Now, the default is going to be one of these down here, these DaVinci Resolve native codecs. These are really, really large file sizes I have found, so don't set your proxies to this. On top of that, you'll also have this thing called optimized media, which is basically DaVinci creating second versions of the footage to be more optimized in your timeline. You could see that the media format here is uncompressed. Now, these uncompressed file types are so large, I've filled up hard drives completely, not knowing what I was doing, so I don't even touch optimized media. I leave all this stuff at default. So I will set my proxy media resolution to quarter, and then I will make sure that my timeline resolution is where I want to be exporting, 4K for most of my cases, and I will hit save. After I set up my project settings, I'll always double check one thing. I'll go up to my DaVinci Resolve button right here, go to Preferences, and then in the Media Storage option, there's a Proxy Generation Location. Now, we can see here that I have the proxy subfolders in Media File Locations selected. That will basically mean that whenever I make proxies of my footage, it will put it right next to the footage location. The default is use project settings, and if we go back to our cogwheel down here and we scroll down, we can see our working folders, and it'll say proxy generation location. And this is putting our proxies in some generic folder on our hard drive. The default will likely be on your C drive wherever DaVinci Resolve is saved, but I have it on a separate hard drive. On average, I would just put all of my proxies and all of my overall files associated with the project in the project folder, just like in Premiere. So when you're starting a project as an Adobe Premiere user switching to DaVinci Resolve, go through some of these steps. It'll make it a little bit easier to switch because everything's localized to that single folder, just like in Adobe Premiere. So once your project files are set, once your project settings is set, we can now start bringing in some footage. So I'm going to pull up some footage over here. This is from one of my latest projects with MoGraph.com, the DAT tour, and I have this folder of footage right here. And just like in Premiere, we can take this folder and drag it in. But unlike Premiere, you have to be very particular with where you drop your footage. And the reason why is because if you were to take this entire footage folder and drop it into our media bin right here, it's going to take a second. And it's going to ask us, would you like to change your project frame rate? I know I did some slow motion footage recording and some standard 24 frame recording. I'm just going to hit change. Don't worry about that for now. We can see that everything is now in this big folder. But I do not want that, actually, because now what happens is in this folder, I have this nice organization of what camera the footage was recorded on and what day. So then it's a little bit more organized. This does not help. So I'm going to go back to DaVinci and hit Control Z. This is something that I was very excited to learn. If you take the footage folder or the master footage hierarchy and drop it into the master bin right here, you can do the same thing, and it will keep your folder hierarchy. Which brings us to my next point. What we can do in this master bin is we can create our folders and our organization just like in Adobe Premiere. So we're going to right click here, new bin, and we'll call this timelines. And just like Premiere, we have our timelines, but they're called sequences. Our timelines in DaVinci are very conveniently named timelines. So I can go to my timelines folder, right click in our media bin over here, create a new timeline, and we can see here that it will either use our base project settings or we can set it up however we want. So I'm going to uncheck the use project settings and get a little bit more specific. I do want 4K, I do want 23.976 because that's what the video footage was recorded in, and I can call this DAT tutorial demo. Sure. Cool. So now we have a timeline in my project. So from here, we can start importing our footage. We can start doing all the fun stuff that we would in Adobe Premiere. But there's a couple more things I want to do to make it feel like Adobe Premiere. The first is I'm going to go to my DaVinci Resolve option up here and keyboard customization. After that, we can see that I have this option right here, and that is JAGS DaVinci 001. That is actually my keyboard shortcut preset that I've made because I'm a sweaty gamer and I use a fancy gaming mouse. However, I would recommend if you are not a sweaty gamer like me and you don't use super custom keyboard shortcuts, you can switch to Adobe Premiere keyboard shortcuts and it will give you a mostly effective keyboard customization layout. Some things will still be different and you will have to go through some growing pains, but you can switch to Adobe Premiere if you want to. So I'm going to switch back to my JAGS keyboard shortcuts for now, discard, and I have my timeline here. Next thing I want to do is I want to have more than one timeline. Now, DaVinci likes to make things very streamlined, and it actually makes Adobe Premiere users a little frustrated because it's like, where are all of my windows? So fortunately, with this button right here, we have our timeline view options. And if we click this, we can see that we have multiple ways to view our timelines, and we have this button here called Stacked Timelines, which is what I want. So I can hit this, and we're not getting a stacked timeline. We're not getting the two timelines on top of each other. Instead, we get this new button on the far right corner of our window. We can hit that, and now we have two timelines. So now I have my DAT demo timeline on the very top, and then I have a new empty timeline on the very bottom, and I have to select something. I don't have any other timelines in my project right now, so I can't really select something. But let's make a new timeline. What I do most of the time with all of my projects is I will take whatever folder that the footage is in, I'll double click on it and I'll make sure that the text is all selected, and I'll hit Control C on my keyboard, and then I will go to my footage. I will select all of the footage. I will right click, and then first things first, I will go to Clip Attributes, and I will make sure that the video frame rate is my desired frame rate for my timeline, so 23.976. And then make sure that's checked. I don't really mess with anything else here. I will click OK. Then I will right click, create a new timeline using selected clips. And then because I just copied that folder name, I can just paste that right there and click create. And now it's going to make a brand new timeline for all of our stuff. I'm going to mute the audio because this is just a B-roll track for me right now. And we can see here that we have our mute selection, our solo audio. We have all of our same tools that we have in Premiere, but you'll have to learn this as you go through the software. You'll find new buttons. But to get started with what I'm trying to accomplish, I want to take this timeline and bring it to this timeline down here. So I'm going to close this one, go to my selected timeline down here, and then drop it in right there. So now if I want to take this clip hypothetically and make an edit, I can go up to my eraser tool right here, or my blade edit tool. Unlike Premiere, it's called the blade, and we can start making a cut there, and we can scroll forward, make a cut there. Then once I have my cuts, I can go to my selection mode and drag it up there just like that. Sweet. I can adjust the in point of my clip by sliding it just like in Premiere and bring it to the very beginning, and maybe I want it to end after about 5 seconds. Select that and go back to my blade tool, cut, go back to my selection tool, and backspace to delete. So with that, we have some footage in our timeline. Now we can see here that this footage looks really, really weird and gross. So what you would do is after you go through all of your selects on your timeline, and you have all the footage that you want in your edit timeline, you can then go to the next tab, which would be the color tab. And you don't have to do this in that order. You could do your color grading before and go through all your clips, or you can do it after you do your editing. Up to you. I always like making sure that my footage looks good, so then when I'm editing, it's a more visually pleasing experience. So what I will do from here is I know that I shot this footage in a flat profile, a log profile. I want to bring this out of that. So very conveniently in DaVinci Resolve, we can look up color, space, transform, and we can drag this node in. So what we're looking at in the color tab is basically all of our color grading tools at our fingertips. And we have, instead of effects and layers in Adobe Premiere, we have a node tree right here, which will allow us to sequentially add effects one by one. It actually ends up being a lot easier to work with than Premiere because all of the effects will live either on a clip or a group of clips. So I have this color space transform, and I want to put this right here at the very end of my node tree because, unfortunately, color grading order matters in DaVinci Resolve. Now, I know that the input color space for this camera, basically what the camera recorded is the input. So I know I set this to Sony S Gamut 3 Cine for the color space and the input gamma is also Sony S-Log3. And the output color space is use timeline. Now, the timeline is basically whatever our project settings are. So in the cog wheel in the lower right-hand corner down here, we have our color management tools right here. Now, we're using the DaVinci Resolve Color Science. Just like Adobe, they have Adobe Color Science and we have DaVinci Color Science. But it's basically going to say our timeline color space and our output color space. Basically, what we're going to render our video to is going to be in Rec 709, which is pretty standard for most screens, monitors, YouTube, etc. So we can just leave that as is, and we know that this was S-Log3, and now it looks a lot more contrasty, a little bit more natural to what the camera had. So I'll keep this node right here, and very easily we can switch between these two nodes, and we have this node that will house all of our effects. So let's say it's a little bit dark in this section. What we can do is we can go down to our lift, our gamma, and our gain, or our offset, and we can start playing with some of these values. Now, because this section is so dark, I know that this is going to be more of my shadows. And you can think about your lift, gamma, and gain like your shadows, midtones, and highlights. It's just a little bit more complex, but we'll get to that in another tutorial. I know I want to bring up this darker section right here, so I'll just bring up the midtones just a little bit, and then I'll bring up the shadows, and maybe I'll bring down the highlights. And I would really just mess with these tools until I got a pleasing image. Now, we're not going to get into the full nitty-gritty of color grading right here. If I were to get really technical, I would add a bunch of masking and stuff to the sky. But your color grading tools are very powerful in DaVinci Resolve, and we can get a very pleasing look if we were to spend more time on this. Just know that these tools in the lower left-hand corner is what you're going to be working with most of the time. Your lift, gamma, and gain. But you also have a bunch of other tabs in your color tab that will allow you to make a lot more fine-tuned adjustments, such as the curves right here. You can see that we have our curves option, we have a masking option right here, we have a tracking option. There's lots of buttons that you can press, just like in Premiere, to get a similar result. So let's say we wanted to add an S-curve to this. We can also just make an S-curve just like that. And that's actually looking a lot better now that we've fussed with this one node. Now, a really cool part about DaVinci is that we can add more nodes that will do specific adjustments. So if I hit Alt-S on my keyboard, now we have this other node, and it's not going to be doing anything. But what I can do is I can go to this tab right here called Blur, and it will have right here little options that will adjust either our blur, our sharpness, or our mist of our image. Now, generally speaking, when you record in a log profile, it will de-sharpen the image a little bit. So I want to bring back a little bit of sharpness. So I will go to the Sharpen tab right here, go to the radius, and if I bring this value down, we can see it's going to sharpen up those images. Now, it looks really, really gross because I'm really cranking it. I will keep this value around like 0.48, 0.47. And if we were to mouse wheel over our window right here and zoom in, and then middle mouse click, and then move our window around, we can see if we hit Control D on our keyboard that we're adding just a touch of sharpness to bring back some more detail into that type right there. Now, there's lots of things that you could be doing in the color grading tab to make it easier to work with. Just so you know, most windows in DaVinci Resolve can be hidden or viewed just by selecting them. So let's say I have this gallery window here and I don't want that. I can unselect that and it's no longer highlighted and we don't have that in our viewport. Same thing here. We have our timeline, which would be this one clip right here. We can turn that off and now we get an even bigger viewport window. We can actually see our specific clips, and we can turn off our nodes or our effects and really manipulate our window just like in Adobe Premiere. Now let's get into the render settings. So let's say I want to take this clip and I want to render it out. I would go to my Deliver tab, and here are my render settings that I always use. I will set my format to QuickTime. I will set my codec to H.265 if I am uploading to YouTube. And for most people who are probably watching this video, if you're uploading to YouTube, H.265. Now, if you have the paid version of DaVinci Resolve, I will set the encoder to NVIDIA. And the reason why I do this is I'm also an After Effects user, and I will do some motion graphics exports from After Effects into DaVinci. And NVIDIA tends to reduce the amount of grossness that will happen. We'll talk about alternatives to that in another video. But I will set this to NVIDIA. If you're just doing video editing in DaVinci, your auto setting should be fine. I'll set this to NVIDIA for my use case. And lastly, the two most important options are going to be this. Your restrict to this number. This is basically your bit rate. Just like in Premiere, how much data is being packed into every single frame. Now, thank you to lots of other YouTubers like Casey Ferris and who is Matt Johnson on having the best render settings videos on YouTube. I pretty much use theirs. You can go check out the reasons why on their channel. But you always want to set the rate control, how constant the data is per frame, to constant instead of variable. And you always want the number to be double your frame rate. So just to make math easy, if we're doing 24 frames per second, let's just multiply that by 2. So that would be 48,000 kilobytes per second. So we could do 48. I always just round up, and I'll set that to 50,000 kilobytes per second, or 50 megabytes per second. After I set all of these settings, I'll make sure that I name my file. So I'll call this tutorial demo. I will click on the browse section and I'll save this wherever I want. So I'll go to my folder where I have this tutorial section, and I have my DaVinci tutorials right here, renders, tutorial demo. I can just drop it in, save that, and hit add to render queue. After that, I can take this clip right here in our render queue, and we can hit render all and render our video. Now, I know this tutorial was a long one, but I wanted to help my Adobe Premiere users get started with DaVinci Resolve because I've been using it for the last couple of years now. There's been a handful of things that I've been unhappy with as far as using Adobe Premiere, and it just makes me frustrated that I pay for a very expensive piece of video editing software and it just crashes and doesn't work and makes me mad. So I've switched to DaVinci Resolve and wanted to make a tutorial for all my friends who are thinking about that switch. Hope this was helpful. If it was, let me know in the comment section down below. If you have questions, comments, concerns, or things you'd like to learn more about, do let me know. But I will leave you with the final learning tip, and that is to eat 1 gram of protein per pound of body weight, and you make some gains. Goodbye, my friends. Bye.